So what can your scholarship, what can history help? Because I do think solidarity is a sort of obviously the name of the game, combined with historical recognition into what actually is our revolutionary tradition, right? And how are we including these different experiences? So speak to perhaps broadly, and even if you're willing, might you have any advice on how to navigate this? Because both sides say, well, you're being class reductionist, you're being race reductionist, and then it becomes a stalemate. So how might we move beyond all of that to something more productive?
Well, I mean, first of all, we need to move away from this Tarzan ethos. Me class, you race. You know, I mean, what folks need to recognize, they need a reconceptualization. That is to say that we're talking about the unpaid sector of the working class, for example, which has been racialized, just like the paid sector of the working class has been racialized. How are the fellow members of the Historians Guild, how are they instructing their students nowadays? If they're telling their students that there was this grand revolution, so-called, well, then how did we get to this point? Where was the rupture? I mean, was it Andrew Jackson? Was it the War of 1812? I mean, and then part of the problem, of course, which I've sought to correct, is that a lot of these historians, they really don't go back past 1750, which is like coming into the movie in the middle and assuming that you knew what transpired before you entered the theater.
All right. Welcome back, friends and comrades. I'm Daniel Tutt. I'm host of Emancipations podcast. And today we have a very special guest, Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne, welcome to the program.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's an honor to have you. I want to start by welcoming guests that have never been to Emancipations podcast. We do podcast interviews on the intersection of Marxism, Marxist theory, psychoanalytic theory, and we invite scholars to give lectures, to give seminars. We also host study groups. Right now, we're hosting a study group on Losurdo's Class Struggle book, which is just started. It's not too late to join. So look around. If you like what you find, feel free to subscribe to the YouTube channel, and you can find us at all the major podcast outlets as well. One of the things that we look at on this show, Dr. Horne, is the meaning of the revolutionary tradition in our time. A lot of historians, I'm thinking of Francois Furet from France and others, have told us that the revolutionary tradition is largely over. And I want to begin by saying a few things about Dr. Horne in the event that you are, which is an unlikely event, unfamiliar with Dr. Horne. He is the Moores Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He is considered one of the most important historians of our time. He focuses on racism, class, slavery, imperialism, and international relations. Dr. Horne is a Marxist in his orientation to history, and he also looks at the history of the left in America, censorship, Hollywood, and anti-communist propaganda. And he also has done a lot of work on the origins of American fascism, which I haven't read, but I'm very excited to read. In 2021, his book called The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century, won the American Book Award. Today, we are here to discuss the 2014 work, which is entitled The Counterrevolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America. I think this book in many ways could be read and should be read in conjunction with your wider sweeping reappraisal of the origins of the U.S. settler movement in the 16th century, in the work that I just mentioned, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, and the very curious formation of whiteness, a kind of militant identity politics. The counter-revolution of 1776 repositions our understanding of the status of Africans in the pre-1776 colonial context. Dr. Horne situates the slave trade and early capitalism of the time, showing the interconnectedness of slave rebellions at a global international level, and how resistance was manipulated by imperial powers, the British, the Spanish, and how the settlers interacted with that interference and how they were interconnected. I want to start, Dr. Horne, with the following question. There's been a long-standing debate about the American Revolution from a Marxist point of view. Is it to be understood as a bourgeois revolution in a pure sense? In my view, it seems difficult to identify what you might call a proletarian element embedded in the sequences that led up to 1776. Some have argued that Shays' rebellion, which happened after 1776, could point to what you might call a brewing class consciousness amongst the settlers. We also have the view of Louise Hartz, who wrote The Liberal Tradition in America, which says that the American Revolution should be understood as a purely bourgeois revolution, precisely because the social order at the time was not revolting against feudalism, as we have later in the French Revolution, for example. So I want to ask you, from those debates, from within the broader Marxist tradition, can we understand, how do you understand this idea of bourgeois revolution and how that might fit into your conception of counter-revolution as well?
Well, it's very interesting. You probably know there's been recent work on England, 1688, for example. And I think the book is called Freedom's Debt. It's published by University of North Carolina Press. And with regard to that, quote, revolution, unquote, the so-called glorious revolution, the author points out that in no small measure, it involved a revolt of the rising merchant class against the monarchy, not least because the merchants wanted to elbow their way in to the lucrative trade in enslaved Africans, accompanied, of course, by massive land grabs in the Americas, and largely succeeded. And therefore, freedom's debt involves a debt to the victims of this process, the enslaved Africans, not least because after 1688, you had an exponential growth in the rise of the trade in enslaved Africans. The merchants descended upon West Africa in particular with the maniacal energy of crazed bees, manacling and handcuffing every African in sight and dragging them across the Atlantic to work for free. Of course, the trade in enslaved Africans was one of the most lucrative businesses known to humankind. You can invest $1 and get $1,700 back. Even today, there are those who would sell their firstborn for a 1,700% profit, let alone some African they did not know. Now, on the one hand, you could be rather cold-blooded, like many of our so-called friends on the left, and salute the rise of capitalism, which lays the foundation for socialism, for example, according to their reading, and giving short shrift to the victims of this process who were unwilling conscripts in this horrific process. And so asking Africans, my ancestors, to salute the process that led to a so-called bourgeois revolution based in no small measure on enslavement, and supposedly builds up the productive processes, which ultimately will lead to socialism somewhere down the road. Stay tuned. I mean, it's like asking the turkeys to celebrate Thanksgiving, because after all, it does bring families together. I mean, what are you, a spoil sport? I mean, for example. I mean, and so I think that the glossing over of the human angle, that is to say, the angle of the enslaved, their sentiments, for example, particularly since we know that they were rebelling from the time they got on the slave ship all the way to the time that they arrived in the Caribbean in particular, because we know that London, up until about the middle of the 18th century, thought that the Caribbean was more valuable than the North American mainland, not least because of the sugar trade and the sugar islands, Jamaica, Barbados, et cetera. And so you can make an argument, in fact, this comes out of my 1776 book, that what happens is that the Africans were so rebellious in the Caribbean, it leads to a kind of great trek, not unlike historians of South Africa and Southern Africa have spoken of a great trek when London ousts the Dutch from the southern tip of Africa at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, and the so-called Afrikaners, this conglomeration of Dutch and French Protestants, Huguenots, they begin a great trek to other parts of the subcontinent, which accelerates after London, spurred by the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, moves to, first of all, circumscribe the African slave trade by 1807, then ban slavery altogether, 1833, 1834. By the way, with the enslavers compensated, their descendants being paid off as recently as 2015, we haven't been able to, at least to this moment, allow for the descendants of the enslaved to be compensated, the struggle for reparations, which of course came up at the recent Commonwealth head of governments meeting in the South Seas, where King Charles and Sir Keir Starmer were hectored by Caribbean leaders in particular. Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa and Prime Minister Modi of New Delhi didn't think it was worth their time to spend time in the South Seas. They thought it was better to spend time with the BRICS in Kazan, Russia, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which I think gives you an indication of what time it is internationally. But I think to connect the point that this glossing over and sweeping under the rug the needs, interests, and sentiments of the unpaid sector of the working class, which relentlessly has engaged in class struggle, unlike many of the settler descendants of the working class, a fair assessment can be made that their specialty is class collaboration, as exemplified by Harold Daggett, the head of East Coast Longshore, he of the $900,000 salary, the palatial New Jersey mansion, the Bentley in his driveway, for example. And because of this ingrained, inured attempt to sweep under the rug the interests of the unpaid sector of the working class and their descendants, you get these anomalies. As of November 2024, when in order to explain the election of Donald J. Trump, some of our friends on the left, who will go unnamed, although I'm quite happy to mention their names if you and your audience are interested, because I've been denouncing them whenever a microphone is put before me, or blaming those who voted most heavily against Mr. Trump. Speaking of the Black community, voting 9-1 in the case of Black women, 8-2 in the case of Black men, they're being blamed for Mr. Trump's victory because the 70+ million Trump base are so outraged by identity politics, which is a rather ambiguous term. I'm not even sure what it means. Obviously doesn't include Israel, a state based upon an exclusivist ethno-religious identity. Doesn't include whiteness, a constructed identity based upon reconciliation between those who had been warring on the shores of Europe, English versus Irish, English versus Scots, English versus Welsh, British versus German, German versus Pole, Russian versus Baltics, Serb versus Croat, Northern Italian versus Southern Italian. All of a sudden, when they cross the Atlantic, they adopt this new identity of whiteness, morphing into white supremacy, which is a war-fighting identity, so that they could unite to seize the land from the indigenous and stock the land when the slave African. Apparently, that's not identity politics. That's like Homo sapiens. It's like a normalized condition, for example. And what's even more dangerous about that, if I can be allowed to step aside from historical currents for a moment, is that it dovetails with the right wing, which is now in the process, according to the Wall Street Journal, of seeking to purge so-called woke generals. And of course, we have many left-wing criticals of wokeness, although I'm not even sure what that means either. Although it's a fair inference that it involves opposition to affirmative action, opposition to diversity, equity, and inclusion, for example. I guess it doesn't mean feminism because, they don't want to alienate the Euro-American women, I guess, for whatever reason. And so the idea now is to purge the woke generals so that when the incoming Secretary of Defense gets an order to use the military against domestic protests, that the woke generals will salute and execute. The non-woke, anti-woke generals will salute and execute, for example. This is what we've come to in this country, for example. And obviously, our, quote, friends, unquote, in the historical guild, they really need to do some serious retooling because their work is not explanatory. I mean, I've been wondering, in these classes being taught from the Atlantic to the Pacific and through the Pacific into Hawaii, how are they explaining this so-called Grand Revolution of 1776, this great leap forward for humanity, and then the rise of Trump, felon, accused rapist, etc., telling lies a mile a minute, for example? Well, did it say he's an aberration? Which it seems to me is sort of lazy thinking, quite frankly, particularly since, to return to history, a good deal of what he is doing mimics, or seeking to do mimics, what Andrew Jackson was doing in the 1820s, for example. The man who disgraces the $20 bill. I'm sure you and your audience know the story of the Cherokees, of the southeast quadrant of North America. A friend the other day was telling me that in her backyard in Atlanta, they used to uncover artifacts from Cherokee culture, for example, because only 200 years ago, and how they sought to assimilate, including sedentary agriculture, Christianity, Cherokee alphabet, their newspapers. You can find at the Huntington Library, San Marino, California, outside of Pasadena. Of course, enslaving Africans. They still have to go. And so they were ousted on the Trail of Tears and sent to Indian Territory, Oklahoma, which was supposed to be a sort of Bantustan, but that was too much. It was eventually, like many promises, the promise of a Bantustan proved to be too much. And by 1907, Oklahoma was a state. And of course, one of his first initiatives was to enact Jim Crow laws, for example. And so today, of course, you have the promise of mass deportation, with the valuation of stocks from the prison industrial complex going through the roof, for example, because the investor class is expecting that promise to be kept. And there have been not so subtle hints that after tens of thousands, perhaps millions of undocumented migrants are ousted, that'll open up housing for the documented, not unlike what Andrew Jackson did, because when the Cherokees were swept out of their mansions, sometimes Europeans fresh off the boat were moving into their homes. All they had to do was sweep the floor, if that. And so, as I said, I'm wondering, how are the fellow members of the Historians Guild, how are they instructing their students nowadays? If they're telling their students that there was this grand revolution, so-called, well, then how did we get to this point? Where was the rupture? I mean, was it Andrew Jackson? Was it the War of 1812? I mean, and then part of the problem, of course, which I've sought to correct, is that a lot of these historians, they really don't go back past 1750, which is like coming into the movie in the middle and assuming that you knew what transpired before you entered the theater, for example. I mean, by 1750, well, the Spanish arrived in Florida in 1565. I mean, actually, the Spanish had arrived north of Florida in the 1520s, for example. So what happened during a few centuries to shape where they pick up the thread in 1750? It's really poor praxis, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
And people should really engage in self-criticism.
I think that's very powerful. And I mean, we have a tradition of Marxists, and many Marxists don't really work in the academy. I'm thinking of CLR James, or even although James was appointed at Howard eventually, but most of his life he was an autodidact. Or Lenin, Trotsky wrote a great book on the Russian language, I think, when he was imprisoned. So but here's the question that I have for you, which is, there seems to be a feeling that the American Revolution provided the world with this optimism. I'm thinking here of "C'est sera, sera," which was this "it'll be fine, of that the French would sing when they were doing their revolution, which they got as a phrase from Benjamin Franklin during the war, where Franklin was asked, "How's it going?" And he said, "It'll be fine." In other words, you're in dire straits, but you have an optimism. So Ernst Bloch, I mean, even Domenico Lacerda in his newly translated work, Western Marxism, chastises Ernst Bloch for his treatment of the American Revolution as overly idealist, in the sense that what is so important for a lot of Marxists, and even CLR James in his book, American Civilization, I think, is the ideas, right? Oh, well, liberty, egalite, fraternite, yeah, that is something that obviously is from France, but the Americans are thought to have implanted this optimism. I wanted to get your thoughts on that general idealism. Do you have any sympathy with this idea that we can salvage something from that optimism that is implicit in the 1776?
Well, what's interesting is that in the United States in particular, you could wake just about any U.S. national, including those on the left, you could wake them up in the middle of the night and they'd start spouting out critiques of socialism, for example. And so we know that they have a critical brain and a critical lens, but somehow it disappears when it comes to a so-called revolution that leads to liquidation of entire nations, indigenous nations, massive land grabs, enslavement of Africans, particularly not only in North America, but as I say in my book on Brazil, the United States by the 1840s is captaining the African slave trade to Brazil, the largest market of all. And in fact, as I point out in this book, in terms of the inhumanity of it all, Henry Wise, who winds up executing John Brown as governor of Virginia in 1859. He's the U.S. minister to Brazil during that moment, and he is opposed to the African slave trade from Brazil and Mozambique to from Angola and Mozambique to Brazil. Why? Is it because he's a humanitarian? No. Silly you. It's because Virginia is developing a breeding industry. Actually, I'm going to go into this in some detail in my book to be published in 9 months. The capital of slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. In other words, this so-called bourgeois republic, its capital was also the capital of the African slave trade, not only in terms of facilitating the slave trade to Brazil and Cuba, where the United States was a leader by the 1790s, shortly after coming into existence. But, you had slaves being sold within shouting distance of the capital as these legislators are prating and prattling about freedom and liberty. Chained Africans are being sold within their vision. And so, to return to the thread, if folks can be so critical of socialism, which I think we can stipulate that they have been across the board, well, then why can't they be critical of republicanism? Because as I suggest in this upcoming book, the whole anti-monarchy project, there's a real reason to believe that it was constructed only to include those, as London used to say, of pure European descent, which is why it's been so difficult to incorporate and include the rest of us. Now, I'm not just a scholar, I'm also a political person, so I'm not looking to burn bridges, particularly since people like me voted most heavily against the right wing are now being blamed by our so-called comrades on the left because of identity politics, of helping to engineer this fiasco of Trumpism. So, but still, people, can we have a little self-criticism here? Optimism. I guess the turkey should be optimistic about Thanksgiving, since, as I said, they brought families together. And so that's something to celebrate. Well, no, thank you. I'm not a left-wing white nationalist. Look at my book, I Dare Say, The Reader, I put out, where I float that concept. And nor am I going to be a Black person who subscribes to left-wing white nationalism, which is an offshoot of right-wing social democracy and right-wing populism, which are reigning philosophies amongst the settler descendants. Thanks, but no thanks.
So, in your conception of counter-revolution, is there a dialectic with a revolutionary tradition? And if so, how might we resurrect it? How might we locate it? Is there a kernel in the tattered history that is emancipatory that you point to? The obvious answer is the rich, and we're going to get to this in a moment, empirical data that you've unearthed regarding slave resistance and rebellion. As evidenced, I think your best strategy there was to show the number of laws enacted to prevent it. That was very powerful. But it is curious, Dr. Horne, that a lot of Marxists don't qualify slave rebellions as emancipatory. Because once capitalism starts, we're sort of in a new terrain. I think that's a very profound misreading. Although some Marxists, including Marx and Engels, have tried to correct that. For example, when Engels wrote his book on the Munster peasant war, part of what he was trying to do, I think, was say, look, actually, Marxists need to think pre-capitalism. Right? We need to go back farther. So I don't want to chastise all Marxists as unable to think the power of slave rebellions. There's been a lot of good work on Haiti, 1804, etc. At the same time, I want to understand the dialectic between counter-revolution and revolution, because obviously we need to find the ways historically to identify with what is truly revolutionary in our history. So what would you say to that?
Well, I mean, that's an easy one. I mean, the revolutionary tradition includes the late, great John Brown, Nat Turner, for example. It includes Harry Bridges, well-born in Melbourne, who leads the San Francisco General Strike of 1934 and goes on to form and lead for decades the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. And of course, is ultimately ousted from the House of Labor, as you have the merger of the AFL, American Federation of Labor, CIO, in the mid-1950s, with the assistance, I'm afraid to say, some forces within the NAACP. That's dealt with at length in my book of the summer of 2024, Armed Struggle, ? Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Claudia Jones, for example, Trinidadian born, migrating to the United States, becoming a leader of the U.S. Communist Party. I mean, we have a grand revolutionary tradition. I mean, I've written about it. I've written about Harry Bridges at length in my second book on Hawaii, for example. Fighting in Paradise. The ILWU plays a preeminent role in helping to turn that archipelago from a bastion of white supremacy to what is now the bluest of the blue states, for example, and still is playing a pivotal role in the politics of the 50th and presumed the final state. Now, as I said in my 1776 book, I don't begrudge non-US nationals for looking at the evaluation of US nationals as to what has transpired on this soil. Not only did they maybe not have the resources to do primary research, which is therefore they rely upon these US national studies. And that's point number one. Then point number two, there's diplomatic niceties. I mean, for example, if you're Ho Chi Minh or even Lenin, you don't necessarily want to alienate this budding superpower by telling them that what they hold dear, 1776, is fraudulent. It was actually a counter-revolution. I mean, I understand that. Diplomatic niceties. As I said, I'm not just a scholar, I'm a politician. I just said that I may downplay certain issues, whereas, once we seize power, I guarantee you I won't be downplaying these issues. So I understand that. But what I find hard to fathom is why these US nationals who have so many primary sources at their fingertips have not been able to grasp the nettle, have not been able to figure out the connection between what we're experiencing today. All this justifiable talk about impending fascism, but the only explanation being it's aberration, which of course will come as a surprise to anybody who knows a thing or two about Jim Crow, for example, which involved mass murder, execution without due process of law. As a matter of fact, you can make an argument that US fascism shares this in common with Jim Crow, as I point out in my book on Texas, The Counterrevolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of US Fascism. That is to say that during the early stages of Texas Jim Crow, the N-word lovers were treated as harshly, in some instances, as the Black people and the Comanches, for example. Indeed, on the cover of the book, hanging and swaying from trees are N-word lovers. That is to say, Euro-Americans, settler descendants, who are being punished and pulverized because they're not going along with the program. And so you can make a case that post-Jim Crow, that US fascism will involve the populace at large, dissidents of various stripes, being treated like N-word lovers were treated in 1870 Texas, for example. And once again, I think we were able to overcome that formidable hurdle because we internationalized the struggle, which brings me to my proposal that I've been floating ever since November 5th, which is that we need an international conference to take place in either Ottawa, Canada, or Havana, perhaps both, focused in the short term on halting the mass deportations. And if people don't feel that that's one of their issues, well, as I said, you may be next. So it is one of your issues. But it has the advantage, hopefully, and I chose Ottawa intentionally, of perhaps bringing in nations with legations in that Canadian capital, the Cubans, the Russians, the Chinese, the French. I could go on in length about a possible French role in this dispensation. And likewise, with regard to Havana, same thing. And of course, the advantage of Havana is that you would have the assistance of the government in organizing such a conference, particularly in light of the fact that little Marco is the Secretary of State designate and obviously is sharpening his hatchet to go after a socialist Cuba. So once again, yes, there is misery, there is degradation, but as ever, there is a way out. Now, as I've also pointed out, speaking to the Black community, ideally, you would expect the NAACP to be the lead organization. But of course, as I and other people have written, it's been compromised over the decades. I mean, they're scared of their own shadow. They think that the right wing would get upset if they were to, oh my God, even hold a conference in Canada, not to mention Cuba. And so I guess they'll wait for the jackbooted thugs to knock at their door and drag them out by the scruff of the neck. But by the end, it'll be too late.
I want to get your thoughts on the current political climate in a moment, but I want to go back to the question about rebellions. And you put so much, I mean, I think one of the merits of your work in 1776 book is the level of empirical proof you show about this international context and the way it stoked and provoked slave uprisings. The Stono uprising is one strong example. Now, there have been historians in the 60s and 70s that put forward a kind of theory that, well, you didn't have rebellions, you had resistance. And this I found problematic, and I am assuming you might agree, and I want you to respond to it. In other words, they said, well, you got cultural and religious resistance, a kind of counter-hegemonic identity. They're influenced by Gramsci amongst the enslaved Africans in the colonies before 1776 and then even after. But you didn't see much rebellion. I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because that seems to be the heart of your work in a certain way, which is to say that this is not a pacified population, and that historians have had it. There might even be an unethical situation on behalf of historians for portraying the enslaved population as passive, when in fact they're connected to an international resistance network. And so could you talk about that international context and how the settlers responded to it through laws and through what was their strategies of pacification, and ultimately why were they not successful in pacifying the enslaved Africans?
Well, it goes back once again to the periods oftentimes, as noted, ignored by the fellow members of this guild. For example, if you look at the roots of the Spanish colonial project, for example, in Cuba, for example, in the 1500s, I mean, you could have African conquistadors as long as they profess Catholicism. Whereas the latecomers to the colonial feasts, speaking of London, in the context of these religious wars, the Protestant underdogs in London versus His Catholic Majesty on the Iberian Peninsula, the Londoners could not afford to be choosy about who could be settlers, so they were recruiting, as I just indicated, more broadly and widely with this militarized identity politics of whiteness. And I think you mentioned Snow Nose Revolt, 1739 in South Carolina, perhaps the bloodiest revolt of colonial North America, which in part was instigated by uniformed Spanish military men crossing over from St. Augustine, Florida. And by the way, the St. Augustine Historical Society is a jewel in terms of those who are seeking to understand the history of Florida, the history of Cuba, the history of Spanish settler colonialism. So they come over and rile up the Africans. And see the problem with many of the late members of our guild, and perhaps even those who are still in the land of the living, is that on the one hand, they want to pay fealty to 1776, bourgeois democratic revolution. And after all, many Europeans were rescued from the ravages of Europe by crossing the Atlantic. So I understand their fealty, but you have to understand that many of us were the victims of that very same process. And supposedly you folks are supposed to be sympathetic to victims. And so what happens is that they try to reconcile the irreconcilable. They want to pay fealty to 1776, and then they want to not ignore African resistance. And so what happens is they inevitably have to suggest that African resistance is purposeless, that is just, as they say in Southeast Asia, running amok, basically. Even though a cursory glance at what John Brown and his comrades were trying to accomplish in the late 1850s when they devised an entire substitute constitution in Canada suggests that they had plans for overthrow and replacement. Or to look at August 1814 in Washington, D.C., covered in some detail in my book, Negro Comrades of the Crown, covered in more detail in the book to come out in 9 months, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. So the Africans joined with the Redcoats to send President Madison and his garrulous spouse, Dolly, fleeing into the streets, one step ahead of the posse, torching a good deal of the city. The reasonable inference being that they were going to replace the regime. And obviously, those on the bottom rail would no longer be at the bottom rail, for example, which is a difficult pill to swallow if you hold the United States dear and see it as the source of many dreams and promises, the source of optimism, as you put it a moment or two ago. Of course, thousands of Africans flee on British boats to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside, for example. And of course, therein, you begin to see some of the roots of Russophobia, as I hint in my upcoming book, because Russia is chosen as a mediator between Washington and London in terms of compensating the enslavers for their lost property. My own opinion is that Russia gave them a good deal, the enslavers. I don't think they should have gotten anything. The enslavers didn't agree. And then, of course, when there was the Crimea War of the 1850s, Britain, France, and the Ottomans against Russia, of course, they're siding with the former. And then when Russia, during the Lincoln years, sends a fleet to both coasts, Atlantic and Pacific, to bulwark the Lincoln regime at a time when London and France are engaged in double dealing with regard to the Lincoln regime, or as the saying goes, they liked the United States so much they wanted to see two of them, US of A and a CS of A. So these US historians, they really need to engage in some massive self-criticism including some of our Marxist friends, because chronologically, I think that they missed the boat about too often, beginning the story in 1750, for example. And then from a class point of view, inattention to the unpaid sector of the working class, which living in the United States should have convinced you, if nothing else, that this is been a reliable source of class struggle, which supposedly people are into. Back to you.
Exactly. I mean, I won't name names, but I will say folks have said, I've even read Marxists say, well, Nat Turner, John Brown were effectively kind of psychotics and rare and madmen, right? And then you get almost like psychopathologization of rebellion. And I think there's nothing worse than that, because I think, you know, there are obviously very salvageable elements philosophically of the Enlightenment. And as such, rebellion has a rationality, does it not? Right? So it's a philosophical question, I think. You know what I mean? And a question of subjectivity that possesses a lot of unethical scholarship, but also misses this rich, and that's what you're filling in, this rich empirical backbone, stretches back further, the origin in the Glorious Revolution, the Somerset case, all of these dynamics, the international context, the imperialism, the way that the African situation would change so rapidly. Take, for example, the 7 Years' War and how that mutated everything.
Mm-hmm.
So that was very useful, because there's this kind of myopia that exists. And okay, you can say something about that, but I want to now move to more of how you think history can help us navigate the debates that we have and the polemics that we have amongst ourselves on the left. And one of the most nauseating ones is this class versus race debate. I mean, I say nauseating in part because I just feel that history could help us here, you know? And there's a sense of, well, your identity politics, but I'm not, you know, this kind of, this you're talking about. So what can your scholarship, what can history help? Because I do think solidarity is a sort of obviously the name of the game, combined with historical recognition into what actually is our revolutionary tradition, right? And how are we including these different experiences? So speak to perhaps broadly, and even if you're willing, might you have any advice on how to navigate this? Because both sides say, well, you're being class reductionist, you're being race reductionist, and then it becomes a stalemate. So how might we move beyond all of that to something more productive?
Well, I mean, first of all, we need to move away from this Tarzan ethos. Me class, you race. You know, I mean, what folks need to recognize, they need a reconceptualization. That is to say that we're talking about the unpaid sector of the working class, for example, which has been racialized, just like the paid sector of the working class has been racialized. Folks tend to have little difficulty with regard to the latter, racialization notwithstanding, seeing that as a class question. For some reason, seeing the former as a class question becomes problematic, which I think is unfortunate. And then seeing, of course, as I've been stressing over the last 50 minutes or so, that these so-called race struggles are ultimately class struggles, because in the Black community in the United States is ultimately a working class community, 90+%, for example. And I'll be brief with this response, unlike my previous responses. That is to say, we need more critiques of republicanism, for example. As I said, the same intensity that has been brought to critiques of socialism need to be turned on republicanism, for example. And I think that's obviously a question for historical sociologists, political philosophers, perhaps even historians. I won't let the guild off the hook. And here's another subject that I've been toying with. It's sort of off the track, but I'm going to be mentioning this in a number of interviews in coming days. We really need a study of how various sectors in the United States of America reacted to the Nixon-Kissinger overtures to China approximately a half century ago, which has obviously led to this juggernaut that bids fair to leave U.S. imperialism sprawling in the dust. I've been mentioning, for example, that at the height of what supposedly the Trump working class base is so upset about is deindustrialization. Well, guess who was at the controls when a lot of the deindustrialization took place? Leonard Woodcock was ambassador to China, former leader of the United Auto Workers, when a lot of this was taking place. And so I'm not going to mention any names, although I have in other venues. But some of these same folks on the left who are trying to blame the Black community and identity politics for the Trump fiasco, they were either supportive of this overture to China, which led to deindustrialization, or they were quiet. And so therefore they're being a bit demagogic and dishonest. For example, as I've suggested elsewhere, you have people who are co-authors of the problems they're not protesting against. And instead of calling it out, typical of the United States, attention is being deflected to victims rather than culprits. As I've said, if the US populace in every demographic had voted like the Black community, Trump would be on his way to jail, not back to the White House. But, it's like as I've said before, the fictional French intellectual who says, I know what you're saying is true in practice. The question is it true in theory? And
that's a good, I got to remember that one. That's a good one.
I've used it about 50 different times. So feel free.
That is very French. God bless them. So 2 final questions, Dr. Horne. Let us ask, since you've been doing a lot of work on American fascism, how okay, this is a powerful concept of counter-revolution, and I see a dialectical reemergence of counter-revolution. How do you theorize that in relationship to fascism, and how might that also change maybe our historical understanding of fascism? Because obviously we think of fascism in this very particular early 20th century emergence in Italy and Germany, right? But with the concept of counter-revolution, things are a little different. That then naturally leads me to ask how you theorize the appearance of Donald Trump as a world historical figure. Hegel, right, has this idea that certain historical figures have a necessity, right? The world spirit on horseback for Napoleon. Marx's 18th of Brumaire has this notion of the repetition of the Bonaparte figure. And the Bonaparte figure from Marxist theory is pretty interesting. A lot of people have abandoned it. I actually think that there's ways to retain it, because Gramsci had the idea that the Bonapartist is a pre-fascist, which is interesting. And insofar as they're kind of hard, like a hard Bonapartist, they basically make contradictory class compromises that maintain bourgeois power, but they don't move to Caesarism. They don't move to full dictatorial status. So I've always thought of Trump as that pre-fascist kind of guy, kind of figure. Would you agree, or would you actually qualify Donald Trump in a legacy, in a historical foothold related to a more distinctive form of American fascism? And if so, what does that look like?
Well, I'm sympathetic to all of those particular hypotheses because, as I see it, to put my cards face up on the table, I not only see revolution as a step-by-step process, I see counter-revolution as a step-by-step process. That is to say that I think Trumpism can ultimately be a vehicle for US fascism. Whether or not it will eventuate in that is another story altogether, because as we know, Trump is sort of a political illiterate. But the press of events, step by step, can lead him to being a full-blown fascist figure and leader. 2 points. One, Nina Turner, the Black woman politician out of Ohio, she recently wrote this piece which I don't necessarily agree with, but I think it's worthy of consideration. She suggests something that I mentioned a moment or two ago, which is invoking fascism, she says, helps to distance the US populace by looking overseas, when actually you've had a kind of proto-fascism, including mass enslavement, genocide, terror on these shores, which I think is a fair point. But I mention it, but obviously I don't subscribe to it altogether because, I wrote this book, The Color of Fascism, about Lawrence Dennis, the intellectual leader of US fascism in the 1930s, who was born a Negro and was melanin deficient, decided to pass, and of course was anointed by the European fascists in the 1930s to be their man on these shores, but for various reasons, fortunately, that did not happen. And speaking of fortunately, it did not happen, one of the points of optimism, sometimes I'm reluctant to have points of optimism because then people feel they don't have to struggle, but I'll mention it anyway, is that our team, we're like a good football team. We're good on defense. We're good fighting defensively, throwing roadblock blocks in the path of the opposition, guerrilla litigation, pop-up demonstrations, wildcat strikes. We're good at defense. Our offense, it's a little shaky. And so because we're a good defensive team, it makes me optimistic that we'll be able to slow down. I'm confident we can slow down the fascist forces. Overcome them? Well, I'll leave a question mark. But I'm confident we can slow them down. You see us gearing up already. So once again, to reiterate, with regard to your question, I think it's legitimate to see Mr. Trump as an authoritarian. I think it's legitimate to see him as a Bonapartist figure. I think it's legitimate to see him as a fascist figure. But how the situation will eventuate right at this moment is unclear, because, to reiterate, revolution I see as a step-by-step process, counter-revolution is a step-by-step process. And so we don't have enough intelligence at this precise moment, when he hasn't even been sworn in, to predict the last chapter of this story.
That is extremely helpful. If I might ask you one final question regarding, the future of socialist politics in America. Now, we just saw a very severe blow dealt to the Democratic Party. I just saw an estimate that we could have over 600,000 deaths in Gaza. Right? And, you got a lot of contradictions going on here. You got a party that refused, speaking of Nina Turner, she was the surrogate to Bernie Sanders, if I'm not mistaken, right? And she was a brilliant one. But look what they did to her, right? Look what they did to Sanders. Now, is there any salvageable hope, optimism with the Democrats? Because it is sure hard to roll a third party in this context. I mean, even Mr. Trump himself said, I realized at some point, because he was started off trying to do third party, and he realized it's a non-starter. And I looked at your biography, Dr. Horne, and I saw you've also been affiliated with third party efforts.
That's right.
Putting your political hat on, we know the impediments. We know the impediments to it. The system is rigged against it. At the same time, it seems to me that any serious socialist effort would have to do that. Will the Democrats learn? Will they absorb their errors in what happened in early November? I don't know. What do you think? And what can a socialist vision be for contesting them? Of course, the Republicans too, but maybe we need to start with them. Your thoughts?
Well, as you know, in the prelude to November 5th, 2024, there was a split on the left with some opting for third-party initiatives, Cornel West, the Greens, Party of Socialism and Liberation, others saying that no, that there needs to be voting for the Democrats and setting aside 30-party initiative. I, of course, I supported my own position, surprise, surprise, which I think was validated at 6 p.m. Central on November 5th, 2024, as I'm watching the returns. The polls in Indiana and Kentucky close. And almost 5 seconds later, they say, oh, Trump won. I mean, 5 seconds after and so my position has been, since we already know that with regard to this electoral college, which is going to be around for a while, that because Republicans see an advantage in it, although Nick Cohn in the New York Times wrote this piece where he suggested that, well, he wrote a lot of pieces that were wrong, so I won't go into that. And so there are only 7 battleground states. I'm here in the state of Texas. Once again, when the polls closed 5 seconds later, we knew that Trump. So why don't we run at least in 43 jurisdictions, third-party candidates? I was watching the totals from Washington, D.C., a city that I study and that I pay attention to. So the Democrats won 90% of the votes. Well, they could have won 80% of the votes. The third party could have gotten 10%, for example. And we would have a foundation for building an alternative, because I'm not necessarily optimistic about the Democratic Party, to put it mildly. As of now, I think that the big capital is at the controls. And at best, the Democratic Party, you know, it's like Gladys Knight and the Pips. I mean, big capital is Gladys Knight, and then people like me are the Pips saying ooh, ooh, ah, ah in the background. I mean, I'm tired of being a Pip. I mean, I want to be Gladys Knight. And so ultimately, I think that we're going to have to challenge from the left, but it's going to have to be an incremental process. And I say this incremental process because, as I was saying about being a scholar and an activist, I'm not ready to burn bridges, even if I think I'm correct with people I don't agree with. And so likewise, if people have it in their heads that you cannot run presidentially against the Democrats, okay, fine. We'll only run against them in 43 states. How about that? I mean, because obviously with the President control, you can get the most votes and lose, as Al Gore and Hillary Clinton could tell you. So at least it'll force folks to put up or shut up when you confront them with overwhelming logic. At least I hope so. And a quibbler may ask, well, why are you concentrating so heavily on presidential races? Well, as you intimated a few months ago, I ran for the U.S. Senate in the state of California, for example. And ultimately, it caused Governor Schwarzenegger, efforts like mine, to try to eliminate third parties. I got 305,000 votes, which they successfully did. So now you have this top two system, for example, which Adam Schiff was able to take advantage of in defeating Katie Porter and Barbara Lee and pushing ahead Steve Garvey, the former first baseman, who he then pummeled into submission. And so, in other words, even with these third-party efforts, we forced the hand in Sacramento of Governor Schwarzenegger to change the system. And so, this politics, it's like a back and forth. I mean, it's we punch, they counterpunch, we punch. And so, ultimately, I think, once again, that we're going to have to have more political independence. We can't go on like this. I mean, we should draw reasonable inferences from this fiasco of November 5th, 2024.
Right. I mean, I think this idea Michael Harrington had with the Democratic Socialists of America of what he called realigning the Democrats. I mean, he said that in the 70s, and that's been the DSA's kind of general strategy. And I just wonder at what point will their turn to their playbook over and over and over to the total neglect of the radical left or the left itself. Right. I wonder when we will learn. Because I think the Democrats have already learned, they've already placated the left and put us in our place. And so, that's the thing that I'm looking at when I look at this question of the working class. The working class didn't show up to vote. Really. You can call the Trump thing. It's such an abuse to say that Trump owns the working class. That is an abuse, man. I don't want to hear anybody say that. It's offensive in my view. You know what I mean? It is offensive, and it's tragic. We should not allow that narrative to happen. But I would love to have you back on, Dr. Horne, to talk about your work on film and Hollywood. Oh, yeah. Very interesting material, as well as on your new work on fascism. It's been a real benefit to me to read your work on 1776, giving us a lot to think about. Could you just tell us in closing what I know you have 3 or 4 projects. Dr. Horne's written over 30 books. One of my supporters wanted to ask you as well, if you could, how are you so productive? That is to paraphrase the question from one of our members of our group. If you could respond to that. And also briefly, what's next in terms of publishing?
Clean living. That's the key. No, well, actually, to be honest, because folks struggled, because the Black working class struggled to create Black studies, and of course, historians have written about that at some length, I was able to get this endowed chair, which has ample research funds, which allows me to travel, for example, which I do quite a bit and have done quite a bit. So that's really it.
Well, and you clearly got a lot of heart in the game. I mean,
oh yeah. I mean,
right? I can't underestimate desire and heart.
That's true. But I always like to talk about stuff I haven't done, because sometimes people give me ideas when they hear about them. So as I said, I have this book coming out in about 9 or 10 months, although we haven't even got to galley a page-proof stage, so I'm still accepting new ideas. The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. I've already given a hint of what that's about, including breeding, for example, in Virginia.
Well, I volunteer with Georgetown University to teach philosophy at the D.C. jail as part of their reparations program. Did you know about that? Georgetown's.
I know about. I've read Georgetown is a major character in this book.
Oh yeah, that was the port, right? The main port of entry, right? Yeah.
And of course, Rachel Swarm's book on the selling of the enslaved that keeps Georgetown afloat in the 1830s. Georgetown formerly being a sort of a Black neighborhood.
I tell everybody that Georgetown has this reparations program, which everybody should look into, because it's free tuition and it's very powerful. And then they have these programs. And I mean, being able to teach at the DC jail was one of the best experiences of my teaching career by far.
Oh, good. Glad to hear it. And then I have this book that I'll be writing next year. This is the third part of a trilogy on counterrevolution. The counterrevolution of 1893, the Hawaii coup and the roots of U.S. imperialism in Asia and the Pacific. Of course, the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy, the U.S. takeover, and U.S. expanding into the Philippines and further out. There's going to be some interesting vignettes in this book. For example, about the Siamese twins out of what is now Thailand, and how they migrate to North Carolina and become enslavers of Africans, and rather vicious enslavers of Africans at that. And of course, father all these children. Don't ask me how, but somehow they do. So I'm going to write that book because I'm having what I consider to be a temporary sojourn in British Columbia, starting on March 1st, which I decided in July when I saw which way the winds were blowing in North America, in the United States. And I'll be following up on a topic that's in my Negro Comrades of the Crown book, which is the influx of Negroes from San Francisco in the mid-19th century to British Columbia. And of course, the governor gives you an idea of the difference between Britain and the United States. These US patriots don't like to hear this sort of thing, but facts are facts. So the governor of British Columbia at that time, Sir James Douglas, would be considered a Negro in the United States. He's a partial African ancestry with roots in Guyana, British Guyana, for example. And then I have this book after that on Egypt, Ethiopia, and the role of the United States. For example, many of the Confederates, after they are defeated, migrate to Egypt, where they lead
the planter class.
Yes, the generals.
Yep.
Confederate generals, they migrate to Egypt, where they lead wars against Ethiopia and are defeated. That's only part of the book. It also deals with the North African enslavement of Euro-Americans. That's really how the book begins. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, of course, paying tribute, for example, to the pirates from Algiers to Tripoli. And in addition to this Canada book, I'm going to start work on go back to my roots. My parents are from Mississippi, and I grew up with stories about the horrors of Mississippi. So I'm going to do a study of slavery in Mississippi, which will bring me to Biloxi, Hattiesburg, Natchez, Pascagoula, Jackson. And
amazing.
Really trying to ask the question, why was Mississippi so terrible?
Right.
That's really the animating question.
Right. You have the example of the Abdurrahman Ibrahim Sori in Natchez, the enslaved Muslim prince. Right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Dr. Horne, thank you very much. We'll close here and want to invite everyone to read your work. It's of extreme importance, and would love to have you back on the show to discuss your scholarship. And we wish you well in Canada. We wish you could. We wish we could join you there.
I hear you. Buckle your seatbelt.
Yeah. Oh God. We hope for the best. Thanks, everyone. Till next time.